Okay, think about this for a second. New York City, early 90s, crime feels, well, everywhere, right?
Totally out of control.
Exactly. Then, just a few years later, boom, it's like night and day. Murders drop. What was it, over 64% in 5 years?
Yeah, and total serious crime almost halved. It wasn't slow, it was sudden.
Hmm.
Like a switch flipped, as you said.
So how does that happen? How does something so ingrained change so fast?
Well, and what's really interesting is that it wasn't the obvious stuff like, say, a massive economic boom turning everything around.
Right. I think the book mentions that the poorest parts of the city were actually dealing with welfare cuts around then.
Exactly. So this kind of dramatic turnaround in a huge social problem,
Mm.
it really makes you ask, what's going on under the surface? What are these hidden factors that can trigger such massive shifts?
That's precisely what we're digging into today. We're going to unpack this idea of the tipping point, this notion that social changes, trends, ideas, they can spread like epidemics, fast, unexpected sometimes.
And we're using Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, as our main source material here.
Right. So the mission for this deep dive is basically to understand how these seemingly small things, tiny factors maybe, can snowball into these really significant societal changes. And hopefully understanding that gives us a new way to look at trends, behaviors, all sorts of shifts in society.
Absolutely. It offers a framework, really.
Okay, so let's jump into the first big concept Gladwell lays out, the law of the few. What's the core idea there?
The key thing is, just like a few people can start a flu epidemic,
Okay.
a small, specific group of people plays a massive, really disproportionate role in spreading social epidemics, trends, ideas, behaviors. It's not everyone pushing equally.
So it's not evenly distributed, it's concentrated.
Exactly. It's about identifying these particularly influential types of people.
And he breaks this few down into three types. Let's start with the connectors. Who are they? What makes them tick?
Connectors are, well, they're the social hubs. People with these incredibly large and diverse networks of friends and acquaintances.
They just seem to know everyone.
Pretty much. And crucially, they know people across lots of different groups, different worlds. They act as bridges. Think of someone like Lois Weisberg in Chicago. She knew artists, politicians, academics,
Yeah.
just everyone.
Right. Or that guy, Roger Horchow, who could fill a friend's restaurant just by making a few calls.
Exactly. That's the power of their network. They link worlds.
Is this related to that 6 degrees of separation idea?
Very much so. Gladwell talks about Stanley Milgram's original experiment, sending letters across the country through acquaintances. Most letters got there in about 5 or 6 steps, yeah.
Yeah.
But the really interesting part was that a handful of individuals, the letters kept passing through the same people, like these specific guys.
Yeah.
Jacobs, Brown, Jones. They were major hubs.
So it's not just a theory. There are these super connected individuals.
Definitely. And Gladwell mentions an acquaintance survey, too.
What did that show?
It just confirmed that the number of people someone knows varies hugely. You find these connectors, people who know vastly more people than average, in pretty much any social group. It's a real phenomenon.
And he uses that story about getting the rights to Gershwin's music.
Yeah.
How connections led to connections.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. The person needed something specific, and by tapping into his network, even seemingly random connections eventually led him right to the people involved with the Gershwin estate. It shows how those networks can unlock things you wouldn't expect.
And the Kevin Bacon game, everyone knows that one. But Bacon isn't even the most connected actor.
No, it's a fun illustration, but actual network analysis showed actors like Rod Steiger, Martin Sheen, Elliot Gould. They were even more central in the Hollywood network.
Wow.
It just reinforces the point. In any system, some nodes are way more connected than others.
So what makes someone a connector? Is it just being outgoing?
It's more than that. Gladwell suggests it's a mix. Curiosity, definitely. Self-confidence, sociability, sure, but also just energy. They like people, they're interested in different worlds, and they have the drive to maintain all those ties.
He contrasts Paul Revere and William Dawes, right? Same message, very different results.
Exactly. A perfect example. Revere was a connector. He knew people everywhere, key people in each town. He was sociable. People knew him, trusted him.
So his message spread.
Like wildfire. Dawes. Nice guy, presumably.
Yeah.
But he didn't have that network. His warnings didn't reach nearly as many people, or the right people, as quickly. Revere's connections were key.
Okay, connectors. Got it. The second type in the law of the few, Mavens. What's their deal?
Mavens are the information specialists. Think of them as the people who accumulate knowledge. They love learning, finding out details, especially about, say, the marketplace. products, prices, deals.
Like Mark Alpert, the guy who knew everything about deals and even blockbuster coupons.
That's him. Mavens aren't just knowledgeable. They have this, like, intrinsic motivation to share that knowledge. They want to help you out.
He calls them price vigilantes at one point. What's that about?
That highlights their role in sort of keeping the marketplace honest. They're the ones who notice if a price is too high or a sale isn't really a sale, and they'll tell people. They provide that market intelligence.
So they're like walking consumer guides. But they're not trying to sell you something, right? That's different from the next step.
Exactly. That's the crucial distinction. A Maven's goal is primarily to educate and help. They share info because they genuinely want to empower others. They're not driven by persuasion, more by helpfulness. They're teachers, guides.
Okay, which leads us neatly to the third type, the salesman. You need people who can actually persuade others.
Absolutely. Information and connections aren't enough on their own. Salesmen are the persuaders. They have this subtle, often nonverbal ability to influence people, like Tom Gow, the financial planner example.
Yeah, he could connect with people through things like mirroring their body language, synchronizing.
Right. And Gladwell talks about studies on simple things, like head nodding. How these subtle cues can be incredibly persuasive, sometimes more than the actual words being spoken.
The Peter Jennings example, too, how subtle expressions might convey bias.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much nonverbal stuff impacts us, often unconsciously, nodding along, smiling. These things can make a message feel more convincing.
And this idea of emotional contagion, that some people are really good at transmitting emotions.
Exactly. These senders, as they're called in some research, they're highly expressive, and their emotions can literally rub off on others. You see someone genuinely happy, it can make you feel a bit happier. Salesmen often have this charisma, this ability to create an emotional connection.
It's like they draw you into their rhythm, their energy.
Yeah, that synchronization.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental human thing, that conversational dance. Skilled communicators, salesmen, tap into that instinctively to build rapport and make their message resonate. It creates a bond.
Okay, law of the few. Connectors, mavens, salesmen. Got it. What's the second rule for an epidemic to take off?
The second rule is the stickiness factor.
Stickiness, meaning...
Memorable.
Memorable, yes, but more than that. It has to be impactful enough to make people actually do something. Change their behavior, buy the product, adopt the idea. The message itself has to have qualities that make it stick.
He uses direct marketing as an example, how they obsessively test tiny changes in ads.
All right, because they get immediate feedback. Does this coupon get used? Does this headline make people call? They have to figure out what works, what actually sticks in people's minds, and prompts action.
And that tetanus booklet example is really telling. Scaring people didn't work as well as adding a map.
Isn't that fascinating? High fear, low fear. Didn't make much difference in vaccination rates. But adding a map to the clinic in the specific hours...
Suddenly people went.
Exactly. It made the abstract threat concrete and actionable. It wasn't just get a shot. It was, here's exactly where and when you can easily get a shot. That practical detail made the message sticky, which seems especially important now with what he calls the clutter problem. Just so much information fighting for attention.
Oh, absolutely. Breaking through that noise is incredibly hard. Your message has to be sticky today just to get noticed, let alone remembered and acted upon.
And this is where the examples of Sesame Street and Blue's Clues come in, showing how stickiness can be engineered, especially for kids learning. What does Sesame Street learn early on?
Well, Ed Palmer's research using the distractor method was key. They literally tested what held kids' attention and what made them look away.
What worked and what didn't?
Funny enough, sometimes things you'd expect kids to like animals, didn't hold attention, as well as simpler, clearer educational bits. They learned segments needed to be short, dialogue simple, wordplay often went over kids' heads.
And that Oscar's blending example, the fun character actually got in the way of the lesson.
Right. Oscar was off to the side doing funny stuff while the main part was about blending letters. Kids watched Oscar.
So the character was too sticky, in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. It distracted from the educational content they were trying to make sticky.
Then Blue's Clues came along and took a different path, building on Sesame Street. What did they change?
They slowed things down. Instead of a fast-paced magazine format, Blue's Clues had a single narrative per episode, a much slower pace, lots of pauses, and repetition. Crucially, repetition.
And they really focused on the visual medium, right? believing kids could follow more complex visual stories.
Yes, creators Todd Kessler and Tracy Santamero felt kids were capable of more sustained attention than maybe Sesame Street gave them credit for. They wanted to respect that intelligence and use the visual nature of TV more effectively for learning.
And it worked, didn't it? Ratings went through the roof.
Massively successful. It showed that their approach, the narrative, the pace, the repetition, making kids feel like active participants, was incredibly sticky for preschoolers.
He mentions that Sesame Street Roy episode again, where the humor about Big Bird wanting a real name just didn't land with preschoolers. Why was that?
It ties into something called the principle of mutual exclusivity. Basically, young kids tend to assume one object has only one name.
Ah, so Big Bird was his real name, as far as they were concerned.
Pretty much. The idea of him wanting another name was just confusing, not funny, for that age group. It shows how you need to understand the cognitive world of your audience to make something stick.
It's interesting, too, how he notes kids often talk more complexly when alone, suggesting they understand more than we might realize.
Yeah, that observation about Emily's monologues. It hints that kids' internal grasp of language and narrative might be richer than their everyday interactions show.
And the research on kids watching Blue's Clues over and over, they actually liked the repetition.
They loved it. It wasn't boring for them, it was mastery. Each viewing allowed them to understand more, predict what was coming, feel smart. That predictability and affirmation is highly engaging for young children.
Blue's Clues also tested episodes way more rigorously, right? Like that animal script example.
Yeah, 3 rounds of testing before airing, testing every episode. That example of ordering the animal clues, antelope, elephant, beaver, etc., from easy to hard.
Why was that order so critical?
It was all about maintaining engagement and building suspense. Start too hard, kids get frustrated. Make it too easy, they get bored. Getting that sequence right kept them involved until the satisfying payoff of solving the puzzle. That careful design is key to stickiness.
Okay, law of the few, stickiness factor. The third rule is the power of context. What's the big idea here?
The power of context argues that epidemics, social or otherwise, are extremely sensitive to the conditions and circumstances of the times and places in which they occur. The environment matters hugely.
He gives those examples like syphilis spreading more in summer, hush puppies taking off in the East Village.
Right, or even Paul Revere's ride maybe being more effective because it was nighttime, people were home, the context implied urgency.
So small changes in the environment can have massive effects on whether something tips?
Exactly. We're profoundly influenced by our context, often much more than we realize. And these contextual factors can nudge behaviors one way or another.
Which brings us back to the New York crime drop. The national decline had some clearer reasons, maybe, but New York's was different.
Yeah, the usual suspects for falling crime, nationally booming economy, aging population, didn't quite fit New York's situation in the early 90s. The economy was still sluggish there, lots of immigration meant the population wasn't aging out of crime.
So something else had to be going on? Is that where the broken windows theory comes in?
Precisely. The argument championed by people like Police Commissioner William Bratton was that crime is deeply influenced by the environment. If a place looks out of control, broken windows, graffiti, turnstile jumping,
it sends a signal.
It sends a signal that nobody cares, that disorder is tolerated. And that, the theory goes, invites more serious crime. So the strategy was, fix the small things, clean the subway cars, crack down on fare beating.
Change the context.
Change the context to signal that order was being maintained.
He paints that vivid picture of the subway in the 80s, total chaos, graffiti, fear, and mentions Bernie Goetz as a symbol of that era.
Yeah, a really stark contrast to the much safer, cleaner subway system later on. That contrast really underlines the power of context. The environment itself changed dramatically.
So this theory suggests criminals aren't just inherently bad people, but they're actually quite sensitive to their surroundings.
That's a key implication. It shifts focus from purely individual character or morality to the powerful influence of the situation. Change the situation, you might change the behavior.
The Stanford prison experiment is such a chilling example of that, isn't it? How quickly students became cruel guards or passive prisoners.
It's deeply unsettling. It shows how potent situational forces can be, how quickly social roles and context can override individual personality traits.
And those studies on children's honesty by Hartshorn and May, finding that honesty isn't really a fixed trait.
Right. Kids would cheat in one situation, but be honest in another. Wasn't consistent. Honesty seemed to depend heavily on the specific circumstances, the context.
which challenges our basic ideas about fixed character.
It really does. It leads into this concept called the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, what's that?
It's our tendency basically to overemphasize personality or character traits when explaining someone's behavior and underestimate the power of the situation, the context.
Like judging a basketball player without realizing the lighting is bad, or assuming someone's smart or dumb based on a rigged quiz game.
Exactly. Those examples. We jump to conclusions about the person, ignoring the surrounding factors. It's a really common mental shortcut.
Even the popular belief about birth order shaping personality outside the family. He argues that's an example of the FAE.
Yeah, because while birth order effects might show up within the family dynamic, research suggests they often don't reliably predict personality or behavior in other contexts. We attribute too much to that fixed trait.
And that Good Samaritan study, seminary students on their way to talk about the Good Samaritan parable.
Walk right past someone clearly needing help.
But only if they were told they were running late.
That was the only significant factor, not how religious they were, not what they were thinking about, just whether they were in a hurry.
That's incredible.
It's a powerful demonstration of the power of context. The immediate situation being late completely overwhelmed their intentions and values.
Okay, so context is huge. Now, Gladwell also brings in this rule of 150. What's the magic number about?
The rule of 150 comes from anthropologist Robin Dunbar. He studied primate brain sizes, specifically the neocortex, and found a correlation between its size and the typical size of their social groups.
And for humans, that number works out to about
around a 150. Dunbar theorized this is roughly the maximum number of people with whom we can maintain stable, meaningful social relationships. People you actually know how they relate to each other.
the number of people you wouldn't feel awkward joining for a drink uninvited, as Gladwell puts it.
Something like that. It's about the limits of our cognitive capacity for maintaining a cohesive social group where there's implicit trust and understanding.
And he gives examples like the Hutterites splitting their colonies at 150.
Right. They do that intentionally to maintain community cohesion and enforce social norms through peer pressure. Once it gets bigger, people become strangers, and the system breaks down.
And Gore Associates, the company that deliberately keeps its plants or work units under 150 people.
Yeah, Gore is famous for its lack of hierarchy, titles, bosses. It relies on small teams, peer pressure, personal relationships to function. Keeping units under 150 helps maintain that small company high-trust ethos.
And this idea of transactive memory fits in here too, the idea that close groups develop a shared memory system.
Exactly. Daniel Wegner's concept. In couples or tight-knit groups, people implicitly know who's responsible for remembering what information. You don't all need to know everything. You know who to ask. That's much more efficient in smaller, cohesive groups like at Gore.
Okay, let's talk about translation. This comes up in the context of spreading ideas, maybe from innovators to the mainstream, like crossing the chasm in tech adoption.
Yeah, that's the idea. Connectors, Mavens, and Salesmen don't just spread ideas. They often have to translate them. They take something that might originate in a niche group or be complex, and they reframe it, making it understandable and appealing to a broader audience.
The Airwalk shoes example is interesting here. They weren't just selling skate shoes to skaters anymore.
Right. Lambesis, their ad agency, realized they needed to translate the cool of skateboarding to a wider youth market. How did they do it?
By associating Airwalks with all sorts of other emerging youth trends, right? Kung fu movies, indie music, X-Files.
Exactly. They didn't just push skateboarding. They identified a whole cluster of cutting-edge cultural elements and linked Airwalk to all of them. They translated the specific niche appeal into a broader statement about being alternative and cool.
So successful translation involves picking up on these underlying cultural cues and maybe tweaking the original idea to make it more palatable.
Precisely. It's like that rumor study. Gladwell mentions how details get dropped or sharpened as a story spreads, usually to make it fit a simpler, more familiar narrative. Translators intuitively do this. They reshape the message for the target audience.
Okay, final stretch. Gladwell uses two contrasting examples. The surprising stickiness of teen suicide in Micronesia and the often unstickiness of anti-smoking campaigns. What's the point there?
It's another powerful illustration of context and social meaning. In Micronesia, tragically, suicide among young men became almost contagious, following a specific pattern or script.
Triggered by seemingly minor disputes.
Often, yes. It wasn't necessarily about deep clinical depression in the Western sense, but more about expressing wounded pride within their specific cultural context. The behavior itself became a sticky social phenomenon.
And that contrasts sharply with anti-smoking efforts, especially aimed at teens. Why do those often fail?
Well, traditional campaigns often focus on long-term health risks. But for teenagers, those risks feel distant. Plus, as Judith Rich Harris argues, smoking can be attractive because it's seen as rebellious, defying adult warnings. The social context makes it sticky for different reasons.
So telling them it's bad for them might even backfire.
It potentially could, yeah. And Gladwell points out that only about a third of teens who try cigarettes actually become regular smokers.
And even among regular smokers, you have chippers who smoke infrequently without appearing addicted.
Right. It suggests the stickiness isn't purely physiological addiction for everyone. Social factors, identity, context play a huge role. Nicotine itself isn't automatically sticky for all experimenters.
So we need different strategies, like anti-sticky things like the nicotine patch.
Yes, things that directly counter the addictive element. And interestingly, the effectiveness of bupropion, an antidepressant, in helping people quit.
That suggests a link between smoking and depression for some.
It does. It implies that for some smokers, the cigarette might be self-medicating an underlying mood issue. Addressing that makes the smoking less sticky.
So the takeaway on risky teen behavior, maybe it's less about stopping all experimentation and more about managing the consequences.
That's the provocative idea. Since experimentation itself isn't always sticky, most kids who try things don't get permanently hooked. Perhaps the focus should be on making the experimentation less dangerous, minimizing the really bad outcomes, rather than an unrealistic goal of preventing any experimentation at all.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, the core idea really is that tiny changes, the right people, the right message, the right context, they can intersect to create these huge shifts.
Absolutely. The law of the few, the stickiness factor, the power of context.
Yeah.
These aren't just abstract theories. You can see them playing out everywhere in fashion trends, business success, crime waves, public health. It gives you a lens to understand how change happens.
It's a powerful framework. So here's something for everyone listening to chew on. Think about a trend or a behavior you've observed recently, maybe something that took off unexpectedly or something that faded away. How might these principles we've talked about, the connectors, mavens, salesmen, the stickiness, the context, how might they have played a role? It's kind of a fascinating way to re-examine the world around us, isn't it?